Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fialka. Today is May 20, 2022. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here with Stephen C. Smith. Thanks so much for your time. Where are you calling in from, Stephen?
I am in Rancho Mirage, California, about 15 minutes from Palm Springs, and a place that coincidentally a lot of filmmakers came to retire and pass on, although I hope I have a few decades ahead of me. But given that I love the movies, it seemed kind of appropriate.
How cool. It sounds like that's where they shot Some Like It Hot, somewhere around there, eh?
Actually, that was San Diego at the big hotel there, the Del Mar, was it? I'm blanking on the name of it, but yeah,
Yeah.
San Diego, not too far, two and a half hours from here.
Oh, okay. So, first question is, what's the best thing for a human being?
The best thing for a human being is to find something that makes them feel fulfilled. I assume we've moved beyond the basic necessities of life, and I think it's finding something that is fulfilling. And I think then the thing that one should strive to do is be as kind and helpful to others as possible, because we're here for such a short time, and everybody needs our help. And I think that's true more than ever these days.
Really well put. Fulfilling, kind, helpful. You're right up my alley, dude. That is really nice of you. A good start. What's your favorite form of information, Stephen? How it comes into you?
I love to read, partly because I can pace the information. Sometimes I can feel information overload from video or audio. And also because, and again, I don't mean to make harp on this incessantly, but the news these days is often so sad to tragic that I find I can only absorb, Ukraine. I can only read about, and that to a limited degree, because it's just so sad. But of course, let's I'll be positive and say that we can learn so much from reading. So
Yeah.
I'm still a big written word fan myself.
Totally there with you. And so, just to divert for a second, did you pick up reading because your parents were doing it? They told you to read, or on your own?
Well, I was very young at the time. I was about four, so I can't give you a definitive answer, but I'll say that when I was introduced to reading, I loved it. And I think I did read a little faster than some. I loved reading books that were a little over my head, like adult fiction. And I don't mean like adult, but I mean the Sherlock Holmes stories by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I remember reading those when I was a little too young to understand a 19th century author, and but it sent me to the dictionary to learn a lot of words, and I sort of fell in love with words and how they sounded, and maybe that's why I wanted to write myself.
It's beautiful. Why do you think humans collect or gather information?
Well, it's the way we're not only able to survive, information starting with, can I stick my head out of the cave and not be eaten by something? But I think that it's the way that the rules are formed for societies to work together, or at least try to work together. And I love collecting information because life is one great treasure hunt. I was fortunate to write so far two books, and both of them, sort of coincidentally, were about composers best known for their work in movies. Bernard Herrmann, who scored Psycho and Citizen Kane and Taxi Driver, Vertigo; Max Steiner, who kind of invented the film score as we know it at the dawn of the talkies and went on to score King Kong, Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, The Searchers. I was fascinated by, I love their movies first, and I love the music. And then I found out they were intensely interesting individuals, and they worked with hundreds of people that fascinated me: Hitchcock, Orson Welles, Truffaut, the Warner Brothers, on and on and on. So their lives, I was fascinated to find out more about them. No one had written books about them yet, so that was a great international search to find their stories. And only after decades, in the case of Hermann, because I started that when I was 19 years old and I'm now in my 50s, I really realized that I think I was drawn to biography because I was trying to figure out, who I was in my own life and where I fit in the world. So I think that's why I've always found other people's stories interesting. I was fortunate to be a producer on a TV series that some of your older viewers may remember, A&E Biography, that was sort of the flagship show of that network back before it was like 24/7 reality shows. They actually made documentaries. And I loved producing documentary programs about people because their stories are just so interesting.
Really well put. And I love the word search and rules. And a lot of what you touched on, we're going to get back to. In regards to information, do you think this need or want to collect information is more innate or more invented by humans?
Well, I think it's innate for the reasons I mentioned before, that to survive, to find food, to find what's safe to eat, I think that's innate. And then I think, to our credit, the invented side is where we move beyond the fundamental needs and we want to find out what kind of music we like best, and find out why that guitarist is better than that one, or that violinist, or why that filmmaker has a better track record, or why I like those paintings more than the others. So, we're so lucky that way to have the brains and hopefully the time to pursue things like that.
It's really good. You also anticipate another question we'll get into a little later. Do thoughts create emotions?
Do thoughts create emotions? Yes. I mean, I think we have to process information, which technically goes through the brain, in order to have an emotional reaction.
Very good. I don't know what I think until I fill in the blank.
Have to tell someone else.
Nah.
A friend of mine who is a reviewer, I'd say, "Did you like that? What are you going to say in your review?" And he'd say, "I don't know. I haven't written it yet." And I think that, of course, we know whether we like, or especially if we don't like something, or if we love something, we're going to feel it. But if, as is often the case, we have complex feelings, say it's an hour album, a 2-hour movie, an 8-part miniseries, whatever, a 400-page book you're reading, there are a lot of thoughts going through your head. And I find that if I have to either tell someone about it, or if I have to write a review of it, that's when I really understand what I think about it.
That's brilliant, because I got it from McLuhan says, I don't know what I think until I say it. Joan Didion says, I don't know what I think until I write it.
Mm-hmm.
So that was good. I like that. Can humans think without language?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the fact that some people sadly don't have the power of speech indicates that they can. So yes, I mean, yeah.
Good.
I would say yes.
Chomsky says a language is not just words. It's a culture, a tradition, a unification of community, a whole history that creates what a community is.
Yes.
Stephen, what do you do when language breaks down? When language doesn't work, what do you do?
Well, I'm trying to think of scenarios where language doesn't work, and that seems to the easiest example I can think of that. When you're trying to communicate with someone, if it's someone and you're speaking 2 different languages, I think we use our hands. I think we point. I think we try to do those gestures that we may incorrectly or correctly think that will be understood. And if language breaks down during a disagreement, I think the best thing to do is to go into other corners.
Very good. Your observations of humans in general, I know it's both and it depends, but just in general, are humans more thinking beings or more feeling beings?
I think feeling. I think that emotion is more intensely. We remember events from our lives, I think, that were strongly emotional, good or bad. And I think that and the things that I love to write about, film, music, those are primarily emotional things. I mean, certainly music is emotional, although it could be intellectual as well. So I think that emotion comes usually a little bit before the thought.
2 questions from Alan Turing, 1950s. Is thinking a function of the soul?
I am not on the level of Alan Turing, so I will defer to whatever he said. No idea.
Yeah, well, that's what we're about, is inventing new questions. You don't have to feel obliged to answer any of these. Can humans, excuse me, that was fun. Can machines think?
Well, it would seem that we can create the appearance of them thinking. I mean, I know a lot of the emails we get are not actually written by people, so we may not call it thinking, but we can call it information processing successfully.
Really well done. Stephen, Do you more pursue happiness or more pursue meaning?
I think happiness, meaning is elusive, and I think that we understand what the meaning of things are often after we experience them. Or so, yeah, I think happiness is a good goal.
Cool. So, do you think the brain more detects consciousness or creates consciousness? Like, is consciousness there bubbling away and we're detecting it, or are we creating it?
No idea. Now you're talking outside my realm completely. I'm sorry to say.
That's all right. In these regards, it's more of what I'm after is your hunch, like what you think. So, or what you feel. It's more like that. Back to the thing. It's more
Well,
like,
I think you answered that earlier question. If we feel before we think, so
yeah.
yeah.
Audre Lorde, the poet, says you can't dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Yvonne Rainer said you can if you expose the tool. What new tool do you gravitate towards? And just again, to put it in context, it's not so much you have to apply or even suss out what the quotes say. It's more like, and the word new doesn't have to apply. It's like, what tool do you gravitate towards?
Well, one tool that I think is important to acquire and master to the best of one's own ability is how to communicate with people who are 20, 40 years younger than you, because as history has shown, they are always using not only a literally different language, but more than ever, we have different kinds of communication languages. I don't do TikTok, I don't do things like that, but I think it's important to understand how people are thinking, what they're using to express their thoughts, emojis. When we first got into texting and everything became shorthanded, that was a really big change for me, because I wasn't used to that kind of shorthand. So I think the important thing to do is to understand how the tools of communication are changing as we live, because they do, and they seem to be changing faster than ever.
Wow, that's right up my alley. That was really good. I haven't had that answer. What new toy do you suggest? Or what toy do you gravitate towards?
Well, define toy.
That's a good comeback question because, for 38 years, I asked, what new tool do you suggest? And then someone said, well, what about toys? And so it's interesting. I've just started asking what new toy as a follow up to tool to see what people say. So, we think general like toy. It's endless what we could think of a toy because a toy could be, oh, a new app. Well, that's like could be defined as a tool too. So again, it's more like you put in the context you want. A jeans. So I would say, what's your hunch lead you to defining a toy? Like playfulness, maybe something
Yeah,
like
that
that.
that's and you will find I'm someone who tries to write with such precision and clarity that when a word can have 5 or 6 different meanings, I always wanna make sure that I understand which meaning is being used, or which what I'm talking about. So I will choose to define toy as something that isn't essential in my life, but is enjoyable. And my favorite toy in that sense is well, it was swing dancing before the pandemic. I loved getting away from my
Wow.
desk all day and moving and connecting with people in a nonverbal language, where you have a partner, someone who could be a total stranger, and you could have a fantastic dance with them for 3 minutes and then not see that person again. And it was like having a whole conversation. So that's a toy that I hope comes back in time.
Dude, I love that. In fact, I interviewed a jazz singer yesterday and I didn't know she was a swing dancer too. And she really promoted swing dancing as this great means of communication and playful. And there is precision to it, but there's also, a looseness to it. And it reminded me of this great saying about dance. If you can't say it, sing it. If you can't sing it, dance
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And I like that, and not essential. So in the future, I can say, if people say, well, how do you define toy as something that's not essential? That's great.
Yeah.
And in a way, it is essential for you. You kept your sanity, so.
It is. And really, I guess the way I ultimately defined it is more like thing that gives me pleasure, because to me, the tool is the thing that helps us. I'm thinking now 2001, that tool is the thing that lets us move from being the Cro-Magnon to flying a spaceship to Jupiter, whereas the toy is what enriches our lives and just makes it more fun.
Brings us pleasure. Because I love the fact that you talked about, hey, I want to decide as a commonality with someone I'm communicating that we have some sense of what words are. So, I'm addicted to etymology.
Hmm.
And the fun thing with etymology is when it says origin unknown. And it's like, well, all words are origin unknown. It's just some person sat in an office and said, well, this word came from here, but it was made up. So it's a fun little game because words are an amazing tool.
They are.
And they're amazing toy. So Stephen, what do you worry about when you go to bed at night?
Don't get me started. Oh my gosh. I really don't worry when I go to bed at night. I'm usually tired and I'm ready to go to bed and get a good night's sleep. So I'm happy to say I try to eliminate thoughts that are going to worry me so that I can get sleep.
Wise words, my friend. That was beautiful. Marshall McLuhan learned from the poet Ezra Pound that artists are the antenna of the race. They're like
Hmm.
broadcasting the hidden psychic effects of our inventions so that we may learn how to cope with what we don't like about the inventions. So, just take somebody like Hitchcock, filmmaker you've explored. There's something deeper that he's saying than just a scary film.
Oh yeah.
And
Yeah. He's
this is
exploring, all of our feelings of fear, of guilt, of panic. And then I also make a lot of documentaries about the film genre of film noir. And I think
exactly.
that whole genre really came out of I mean, there are things that anticipate it, but really the movies come out of World War II and really came into its own after World War II, when so many things were changing, the roles of men and women. Men were traumatized. The Russians and had the atom bomb after we did. The world was very uncertain, and those films noir are actually incredible explorations of the preoccupations of the day, and they are sufficiently timeless to appeal to an enormous audience now.
It's amazing because it is a good example of the deeper hidden psychic effects that the film noir artists were making. Detour, Gun Crazy, it's endless. They are not just crime movies and guys smoking cigarettes. But McLuhan's question I ask you, Stephen, is why do we ignore the hidden psychic effects, even though the artists are broadcasting them to us? And
Well,
what I mean when I say artists, mean filmmakers,
yes.
authors, everything. Yeah.
I'm only questioning the word ignore because I don't think necessarily people do ignore them. I
Yeah.
also resist generalizations about people. And I think that the fact that the movies or books or whatever resonate with people suggests they're not ignoring them. They're finding ways to think about them and explore them, whether they know it or not. And obviously, the filmmakers are tapping into feelings of the public, or these movies wouldn't resonate for them. So I don't know. Some people ignore as much as they can about the real world, and others feel it strongly. The old saying about life being a comedy for those who feel and think. Life's a tragedy for those who think, and a comedy for those who feel, or the other way around. I can't remember. It's the other way around, isn't it?
I'm not even sure, but it's beautiful because it could be that Mobius strip that,
Yeah.
the since I'm so fond of aphorisms, it's fun when you mix them up and no one knows you mixed it up because it's almost getting you to think. But I like what you said because I think somewhere I read a great quote said the filmmaker said, well, what's important is what people talk about after they see your film. Like the talking with your co-viewers is where the film is really resonating.
Yeah.
It's like the film is one thing, and that's sort of like what McLuhan was learning from Ezra Pound, that these guys or these artists are like the antennas broadcasting. So that was good. But do you think artists have moral obligation?
Well, I think everybody has a moral obligation to not be deeply immoral, and by that I don't mean in the prudish sense, but the basic things of not hurting other people, and
Yeah.
and the things we would define as a fundamental morality for a society to function. So I think in that sense, I don't think artists are uh, any more committed or should be held to that than anyone else. I think that we all uh, should follow some basic. I think artists, and people define morality differently. Again, I think we'd have to define that a lot more, because I think that some of the greatest artists have been disruptors, as we know, whether it's Stravinsky and the Rite of Spring music that caused a riot in 1913, a literal riot in a concert hall, or Picasso and Guernica and many other works, Hitchcock with Psycho. I mean, there have been so many disruptive works and works that don't seem to have a moral center. Jonathan Swift, who would write outrageous satire that offended people who took him seriously, when in fact he was critiquing the society of his time. So I think it's a little dangerous to talk about whether people are being moral or not, because that sounds like a lot of people I don't care for. And I won't get more into that.
You're a comprehensivist. I really appreciate that. You really put it into context in a big picture. I mean, Pascal, the philosopher, mathematician, said, in order to understand anything, you have to know this end of the spectrum and that, and everything in between, like the big picture.
Right.
Stephen, are you more afraid of new ideas or more afraid of old ideas?
I'm not afraid of either. I think there are a lot of great old ideas, and by old ideas that we can say inventions, music written in the past. And I think new ideas are fantastic, because without them, society is not going to move forward. This ball we live on is not going to be here forever. So we've got to continue moving out if we're going to last a long time. And no, ideas are great. Good ideas are always good. Good ideas are always good, and bad ideas are always bad.
Yeah. Bravo. Can you conjure up your earliest memory ever, or one of them?
Gosh, earliest memory ever. It's really, really strange, but it's probably a sign of, other than the kind of classic images we have of home, I had a ventriloquist dummy that I spoke with, and it talked back to me a lot. So I think I was able to project a lot of imagination into inanimate objects. So that's probably one that comes to mind.
I like that. Do you think memory is more a curse or more a blessing?
Oh, I think it's a blessing, because anyone who knows someone who has lost their memory knows how sad it is to see someone lose their identity, basically, because without memory, we don't know who we are or the people that have been in our lives to make the difference.
Beautiful. Can you tell me someone within your immediate family and then outside your immediate family who had an impact on you, was like a role model? Just briefly, what was that specific impact?
That's very easy. I have one brother. He's 17 years older than I am, although I always say he's 17 years younger than I am, because he's so energetic and active. And he was already in college in another part of the state when I was born. So we were kind of both only children raised by the same parents. And when he came into my life, it was always kind of for visits. And he was the one he became a Broadway actor, a successful stage director and producer. And he introduced me to this whole exciting world of entertainment while I had fairly traditional parents. So he showed me a world of excitement and creativity that was wonderful. And one of the reasons that my wife and I moved to Rancho Mirage is because I can finally live in the same city as my brother. And we're enjoying that immensely. So he was one of the great formative people in my life, and certainly in my family. And also, when I mentioned to him at age 19 that I wanted to read a book about the composer Bernard Herrmann, and there wasn't one, he said the words over Thanksgiving dinner that changed my life. He said, "Well, why don't you write one?" And because you don't know what you don't know when you're 19, I started writing a book, and that gave me a career. And one person who influenced me outside of that is, if anyone who's ever seen Turner Classic Movies in days past might know the name Robert Osborne. He was the host of it for about 20 years. And Bob Osborne was a friend of my brother's. And Bob had a similarly generous heart that, when I was about 9 years old and already kind of a movie geek, memorizing, everything I could about every classic film, he would invite me to his home. And this is in a pre-video age of the 1970s. And he would have a 16 millimeter projector showing classic movies. I remember seeing Dr. Strangelove there. And he would introduce me to filmmakers that came to the parties. So it seemed very normal to be moving in a circle of these creative people. And that's why when I later became an interviewer of them for television documentaries and writing books, it felt like a very comfortable thing to do.
Wow. So you sat in Bob Osborne's living room and watched a 16 millimeter print of Dr. Strangelove. How cool is that? Is cool.
I can remember where I was standing, how many people were around me at the time, how I was looking at the movie. I remember the classic War Room table wide shot there. And I remember that movie, even though, of course, I couldn't really understand a lot of it at 9, or I didn't understand the intricacies of it, the emotion of it. And again, going back to thinking versus emotion, the emotion of kind of dread in that film, of whistling through the graveyard, of a horror comedy, all the things that movie is. The sense, the emotional sense that Kubrick wanted adults to feel was something that I got as a 9 or 10-year-old very strongly.
Dude, we could talk about Kubrick for hours, but just briefly, I've interviewed Terry Southern's son, who wrote that film, with all these same questions, and he's a great person. And then I've interviewed James Harris, who worked with Kubrick on about 6 or 8 films, but only 3 to 4 have the James Harris credit, but another amazing human being.
Yes, I've seen him.
So, yeah. And so one trivia question: is there any chance that the pie fighting scene in Strangelove actually could possibly exist on film somewhere, or are there only stills, to your knowledge?
Well, I have only seen stills, but I also thought, and I could be wrong, Kubrick was so attentive to things. And by that time, that was really the film that moved him into independence. I bet that does exist. And I thought that I had heard that it existed. But I don't know if anyone else does.
That's enough. Stephen, that's enough. I thought, when I ask people like this, they go, I vaguely remember someone saying that's enough, because someday, 50 years down the line, the New Zealand film archives are going to go, we've got a copy. Go ahead. Sorry.
No one will have it if it isn't let out of Kubrick's vault. But I tell you, the person who does know it is, and forgive me, I could have it wrong, but I believe it was his brother-in-law who produced a lengthy documentary about Kubrick for the Warner Home Video collection of his films that came out on DVD in the late 90s, early aughts. Yeah. And I believe that brother-in-law is the person who is the sort of keeper of the archive, along with Kubrick's widow. Right. So those are the two people that, if one ever was in a conversational situation with, they would certainly know.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, my friend worked for Kubrick once over the phone, and he was known to do like 4, 6 hour, 8 hour phone conversations.
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, how long did you get to talk to him? Like, could you imagine being on a phone for 8 hours with Stanley Kubrick? What an amazing, but it was pre-Zoom, of course. So did your parents raise you a particular religion?
Yes, we were Episcopal, and my parents were very active in the church, and I was a little altar boy for many years in that. And I'm still trying to figure out to what degree that influenced me. There were a lot of kind and nice people I met through that. I am sort of agnostic in spirit, but at the same time, I will agree that something created the space we live in, and I have no idea what that was. But if one wants to put a word to that, something is responsible for our being here, whether it was an accident or of chemistry or something more intentional, let's say. So, I'm not, I someday perhaps we'll find out.
Very good. Do you pray
Well, that cliche of there are no atheists in a foxhole. Yeah, I think anytime one is in a truly desperate situation, and it was only recently that I heard prayer defined as something that does not have to have a religious component, but can simply be an expressed wish sent out there. So, in that sense, I certainly have and do.
Stephen, if God does exist, what would you like God to say to you after you die?
Come on in.
That's pretty. It'd be like, Bob Osborne. I got 16 millimeter copy. Let's
Yeah,
watch.
take me to where Bob Osborne is. I want to watch more movies.
Come on in. Do evil people exist, or does evil use people as a vehicle?
Well, again, it comes down to semantics, and I think if evil is being used in a non-religious sense, for me, it means someone like Putin, who is purely someone sociopathic who can kill innocent people, so massively and feel nothing about it. Yeah, evil exists. It
Yeah.
does, that definition.
And the follow-up is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? And this one, I'll start with a few modern thinkers' thoughts,
Mm,
especially some filmmakers. Alan Watts says, if you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them. Coppola stole from the mob and the samurai. Keep your friends close and your enemies closer.
yes.
JFK says, forgive your enemy, but don't forget their name. And Fellini says, I need an enemy. So it's a lot of thoughts. The basic question is, how do you advise someone to deal with an enemy? But first, how would you respond to Alan Watts? If you acknowledge your enemy, you empower them.
Well, I do think that if one gives attention to people who want it, and you think that they are harmful people in the world, don't give them what they want, which is attention. And that's true of people in our, like, I won't be drawn into arguments online with people about things. It's such a pointless waste of time. I really don't like time wasting situations.
Yeah.
Looking at my own life, a lot of people that I thought of as enemies, as I got older, I realized had their own vantage point and perspective, and I was wrong about things. And it was a kind of a powerful experience to find those people later and say, I'm sorry that happened between us. I realized I had a part in that. And so I tried to take people who I'd once thought of as enemies and heal with them, and almost to a person that was a successful connection that rebooted things. If someone is truly an enemy, adversarial to us, and we all have those in life, you simply have to move beyond them and not worry about them. And if you can anticipate ways that they may be harmful to your life, like if they're saying bad things about you to someone that you actually care about, you can let that person individually know your side of things. But I think the best thing to do is simply move on and try to not give them the air and space that they want, because usually they'll move on to somebody else to be an enemy with.
Really wise words. So James Joyce was the first projectionist in Dublin over 100 years ago. He basically checked out. He said, this is stupid. Why should I go inside a building and see a movie of a tree when I can go outside and see a real tree? Years later, Faulkner said, sometimes the best fiction is more true than journalism. Why do we have to recreate things in order to get them? Why do we have to go to a theatrical play of people acting out life? Why don't we just live life?
Because happily, my life has never had any of the elements or any of the significant disastrous plot points of Hamlet or King Lear or Double Indemnity or Psycho. And those are tremendous emotional roller coaster rides that make us think about the human condition while entertaining us. So that's why.
It's beautiful. And bringing up Billy Wilder's one of his masterpieces. What an amazing filmmaker. Did you know, in regards to Will Smith's slap, that those kind of things have happened at the Oscars before? Billy tripped Leo McCarey. Did you know this? What
I
year?
know the story. Now, that said, and I interviewed Billy Wilder once, and I'm a huge Billy Wilder fan. Like every filmmaker, like everybody who works in Hollywood, and maybe everyone who lives, he knew how to make a good story better. So if it came from him, there was a wonderful archivist and author, I mean, a historian and author named Rudy Belmer. And he said the two best words to me ever while writing nonfiction, he said, never assume. And so just because we've heard that story, and I love good stories, I want proof that it happened, So
Right.
there's so many Hollywood stories that happened that didn't happen.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that you can't tell a great story.
No.
I'm of the school that says there's this great story about X. Here's what really happened, and you get the entertainment value of the legend, and then you get the hopefully interesting information of the truth. Now,
Yeah.
I heard that, and I wouldn't put it past Billy Wilder, by the way.
That he actually, as Leo McCarey's going up the aisle, winning the award over him, he tripped him.
Yeah. Well, happily for maybe Leo McCarey, the Oscars weren't televised until about 1954, I think. So
Really, yeah. Amazing, really well put too, because it is that whole. It's this phenomenon of is humans can think it, say it, and do it, and so we can think. Someone can think that story up. Someone can start saying it. Did it actually ever happen? Is another thing.
Yeah, I'll give you a great Billy Wilder example because I love the story. He was a journalist in Berlin and in Vienna, and he said that on one day he interviewed Sigmund Freud and two other great people living at the time in Vienna. I don't remember who they were, and someone finally proved that those people weren't all in Vienna at the same time, and made a big deal out of it to Wilder, who of course was irritated. So what Wilder's biographer, rather, one of them concluded was that Billy did interview those people, but it was a better story to say he did it all on one day because, well, filmmakers consolidate time, don't they? That's one of the great things to do to make something interesting. Hitchcock said that movies were life with the boring bits cut out, so.
That's a good one. Life with the boring bits. That goes right along with it. So just sort of walk us through briefly, Stephen, how you got to that point. I mean, you already told that story, great story, where your brother said, well, write the book. But you're growing up and you're experiencing all these films and books and, entertainment, you called it, this art form. And at what point did you go, I can do that? Like, let's go with, first being a documentary producer. Did you go to film school and study that? And what was the tipping point? I can do that. And then you sort of set up with the book, but you can reiterate anything in that regards as a documentary film producer and as an author.
Yeah. Well, like so many people, except now it's so much easier to do with our iPhones and things. I was a filmmaker at age 10 or so with my friends acting out the movies we'd make, and somebody would edit them. and so I think I was always drawn to storytelling. And my brother would take me around the same time when I was 9 years old, 8 years old, even 8, 9 years old. We'd go to the motion picture retirement home in Woodland Hills, where they had people like Larry Fine of the Three Stooges, and wonderful silent comedians were still alive. And we'd interview them. We'd take a tape recorder and we'd ask them questions about their careers. And it all felt, as I say, simply because of where I lived, it felt normal. And so I think that gave me the confidence. And I have to say that even though my parents, weren't in these fields, my dad was an attorney. They were supportive of us. Maybe they were puzzled and I think confused, probably disappointed, but they supported my brothers and my interest in the arts. And so when I started writing the book, I just thought, well, maybe these will just be a bunch of interviews that I assemble as Q&As. And then as time went on, I got more ambitious and decided to write it. And the mere act of deciding to do these interviews made me commit to a major finally in college. And in those days it was called, and I don't think it's even called this anymore, broadcast journalism. So you basically learned how to be a print journalist, write for magazines and newspapers, but you also learned how to work in television, in news and documentary. And I'm very grateful that was the path I chose, because I ended up working in all those fields. I wrote for the LA Times, I wrote for magazines, I worked in TV news for a while, and I made documentaries. So I had a good training. And so really, again, the mentors, the teachers I had, I was so lucky in having good people give me confidence. And I think anything we're interested in, we stand a better chance of doing well. Not always, but that's pretty much how it happened for me.
That is beautiful. But now I have to interject some anecdotal kind of things, be selfish. Is ever interview Corla Pandit?
No.
Did you ever see him live?
Nope.
Because his story is amazing. How, did you ever read or see the doc on him, or read RJ Smith's article in the LA magazine, where he sort of broke it that he was a black man and he disguised himself as an Indian for 6 decades, basically.
Yeah. No, that was a little off my radar.
Yeah. Very interesting guy in that world. And then did you study any of the Theosophy Society kind of entertainment crossovers?
Not until later. I did some documentary work on the director Anthony Mann, who had been a part of that very young, and he went on to make great film noir titles like Raw Deal and T-Men, and then he directed epics like El Cid, and really had an exceptional and varied filmography. And he was a product of that upbringing.
Of the Theosophy Society? Because isn't that their headquarters, that Beswick Theater on, I think, Crescent Heights, or it's the oldest movie theater in LA? Do you know that place?
No, I mean, the oldest movie theater in LA, I think, is currently, that's still running, is the Egyptian Theater, which opened in 1922. And again, my knowledge of the society was only with respect to someone I was doing a documentary on and his involvement in like the 1900s. So I don't know anything beyond that.
Right. Well, I'm going to look into Anthony Mann. That's really cool. I'll get you the name of that theater, because I'm sure maybe it was more it was like Orson Welles was hanging out there. It's a small little theater, and it looks like
it is.
It looks like just a normal house there, but it's where Theosophy Society meets now. So I'll find it out and let you know. It's very interesting. So this is, you use the creative, you're definitely a wordsmith. You know how to put words together. And so these next 2 questions, I'd love you to put into the context of yourself, and then how you think Max and Bernard would sort of approach these things, because you've delved so deeply into them, and I'm really grateful. So a screenwriting teacher told me a great film is when you can clearly see the intention of the maker. Stanley Kubrick says the opposite. Great film is when you can clearly not see the intention of the maker. What role does intention play in your creative process?
Well, intention is important for a writer or filmmaker or composer to at least make choices that are cohesive. But I resist kind of binary choices like those 2 quotes you gave me. And I think that everything, I wouldn't want to live in a world where let me put it this way. I don't like movies where it is so obvious what the message of it is that I'm being hit over the head with it. No, no one really likes that. And I'm more open to a film that is ambiguous, like it was for many people in 1968, 2001, A Space Odyssey, one of my favorite movies, and a movie that baffled me as a child when I saw it on television. It didn't help that I was seeing like a third of the image, as they used to call it, pan and scanned to fit on a square TV with commercials every 10 minutes. But, I was kind of fascinated and irritated by that experience. And later it became one of my favorite films. And there's a wonderful book, you may know about it, called Space Odyssey. That's one of the best making of books of all time, where it really
amazing book.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what I've tried to do in my documentaries is answer the question, why did this happen and what was the effect of it? And I love how in that case, 2001 started with Kubrick saying, I want to make an intelligent, I think he even said the first intelligent science fiction film. And he didn't know how to go about it at first. And of all people, the jazz clarinetist great Artie Shaw said, hey, have you read Arthur C. Clarke? And when Kubrick read Arthur C. Clarke and connected with him, Clarke drew from things that he'd already written and ideas he had combined with Kubrick's thoughts, and they were off to the races. And I thought that book also brilliantly shows how, as Clarke wrote the, if you will, novelization or concurrent novel as the film was being made, the novel really does explain things in a very clear way. I think, it's not it's not the mystery that the movie is. And to Clark's surprise, Kubrick was eliminating he cut the initial plan for narration that was going to explain everything, and he made a film that dared its audience to be confused, and in fact had a disastrous first screening in New York. The very first time an audience saw it, it was heckled and yelled at, and it was a celebrity audience, and Rock Hudson shouted out something like, "I'll give somebody $1,000 if they can tell me what this movie's about." And Kubrick stayed cool, and he looked at the movie and he cut either 17 or 19 minutes out of it, and he added the title cards that separate the time sections of the movie. And we have a movie that I think is absolutely intelligible to the extent that it needs to be, while being ambiguous in a way that invites us to draw our own conclusions.
Boy, dude, I want to hire you to write the screenplay for my film. We're remaking. Listen to this. This is Steven. You know film history so well. We're remaking the prequel to 2001, and the prequel doesn't exist. so my first feature, I remade Orson Welles' Other Side of the Wind before it came out. So we do these impossible things, but you really taught me a lot. But I'm curious if you know that, and you really summarize everything you said. Is that in Space Odyssey? Because I have that book, but I haven't really read it. That's pretty.
Yeah, that's the tip of the iceberg. Every page is fascinating, and what I loved about it is that, again, talking about how things aren't good or bad, but Kubrick emerges as an incredibly complex person, and there most of the time I was so impressed with his openness, and one of the key decisions of the movie was made by what they called in the British film industry the tea boy, the person who brings the tea to people in London, because it was all made in Britain. And the person who was working basically as the lowest production assistant happened to overhear when Kubrick was being told by his location scouts that there was no kind of desert-like landscape in Britain that would work for those shots of the flyover that we see, Dave Bowman doing near the end. And this young man said, "Oh, I know a place in Scotland that I think will work for you." And Kubrick said, "Sit down." And that person, who was the brother, if I'm remembering correctly, of Jane Birkin, the actress, or it was either Jane Birkin or Olivia Hussey's brother. So somebody with some sort of connection to the industry, but low on the totem pole. This young man became an integral part of the last part of the filming, and he flew in the helicopter with like a kamikaze pilot in the locations they eventually found, which were different from the one he suggested. But when they found them, and the pilot, they went through pilots, because the pilots say, "We're going to get killed if we try to fly any lower or do this." But this young man would get in these helicopters with these pilots and shoot that footage that then is given that negative look to it. And the fact that Kubrick was so open to hear ideas from anyone like that is great. On the other hand, many chapters earlier, he endangered a stuntman because he didn't want to put a second wire on somebody, and the first wire broke, and that actor was able to cling onto something, that stuntman, and save his life. And Kubrick reportedly ran out because he knew that guy would probably punch his lights out. And Kubrick stayed away, I think, for a day or two, because he knew he had endangered this man, and this man was very mad. And, that doesn't speak well, but artists are complicated people. They have their good days and bad days.
Bad days, yeah. No, that's amazing what you're saying. Do you know that author of Space Odyssey?
Not personally, no.
Yeah, because I watched that lecture he did on YouTube, and he is amazing. And I do have to. I've had that book because I studied James Joyce. The whole first chapter is about James Joyce in the Space Odyssey book, and I'm like, what? Yeah. But two quick things. Did you know Frank Zappa shot 200 Motels, his first feature, at Pinewood Studios? That's where Kubrick shot 2001.
I think it's Borum Studios, but I could be mistaken. I'll look it up, because Kubrick got a whole studio basically.
Frank uses the monolith in 200 Motels, and it just came up. I know we could track it down. Was it the actual? Huh?
Sorry, Boreham Wood was the studio, the MGM British studio where Kubrick worked.
Well, it was used in 200 Motels, and I'm not sure if it's the same monolith, but it's like this black monolith. And Frank's making fun of it, and I'm like, it could have been because it could have been storage for the props or something, but I'm not positive.
Not a hard prop to recreate, though, if you want to.
Right. and so yeah, we're doing is taking one of these TV sets that people use to watch their movies on in their living room and turning it on its side and look like the monolith. But have you ever heard this one? They asked Stanley, "Why'd you make 2001?" He said, "To convolate Marshall McLuhan." Have you ever heard that?
Nope.
That is documented. I think it's in Stanley's Playboy interview or somewhere. And it's very interesting because this again is like your stories, like were you there? So Stanley invited Marshall to a pre-release screening of 2001. And Marshall supposedly fell asleep after 10 minutes.
Older people did in 1968. Older people did, especially.
And, you know, it's a more complicated story because I'm sure, I mean, I wish I was there when Marshall was talking to Stanley and if they had a discussion, because I'm sure he woke up and saw the rest of the film, or there's various stories how to suss it out. But just to repeat it like that is funny, I think. So go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I have fallen asleep on many movies I liked a lot, too. So sometimes you're just tired.
It totally is true for me. Yeah. It always happens. So the second question was, and I appreciate, I mean, we went off such a divert, but again, throwing in Steiner or Bernard, any, thoughts in these questions. But this one too is Marcel Duchamp said, "There's no art without an audience." How much are you thinking of your reader when you're writing your book or producing your doc? How much are you thinking of your viewer?
Well, I am thinking of the viewer, and you have to consider your audience. Are you telling a story clearly if you're making a documentary? I mean, I'm not making abstract works because I think there are people who don't consider their audience. And again, I don't think there's any right or wrong answer to this. People can create things. I mean, when Antonioni made his breakthrough films of the early 60s, he was making those in a way where he really said to the audience, "This is what I feel. If you respond to it, great. If you don't, that's not my problem." And but if I'm making a documentary, yes, I am wanting to make sure that there's the two things that I always try to have are compelling information and emotion. Because if you have compelling information but not enough emotion, people will be bored. And if you have pure emotion and not much interesting information, people will also tune out after a while, I think. So I am thinking about that. The audience on my books that I think about is someone who I know and want to please. My brother, great film expert, or a close friend who loves film music or films. So I'll think about them. But then at the same time, particularly writing about a not easy subject to write about, which is to say music, putting it on paper and making non-musicians understand it and feel it if they haven't ever heard it before. That's really kind of the fun challenge of trying to find ways to take a language that really is great because it's not about words, it's sound, and trying to make it try to communicate what it is both emotionally conveying and how it intellectually works, conveying that in words. The person who did it better than anyone was Leonard Bernstein in the 50s and 60s and 70s. He did a lot of television programs talking about classical music. He had a very successful series called Young People's Concerts. And even though, yes, it's billed as young people and there are a lot of children in the audience, I mean, it's adult level conversation. He's not talking down to them. He's just communicating. And he was so brilliant at communicating what he loved about music. So I go back to Bernstein when I write about music to try to find a way in. And then I try to, as I say, write for both someone close to me, even writing for myself, would I want to read this, while also trying to engage somebody who has potentially no interest in this at all, but I might hook into a good story. And again, the reason that I did those two books weren't because they were about film composers, but their lives and their personalities were so fascinating to me, and they worked on so many things that meant a lot to me. But if they hadn't had interesting lives, I mean, there's several people who've done great work that I would never consider writing a book about, simply because their lives aren't compelling enough. And there's the famous story of Flaubert, who lived his life in a bourgeois manner so that he could be a rebel or an anarchist in his art. People can look up the quote on that. But Hitchcock was much the same way. He lived a pretty conventional life and lived out all of his fantasies and dreams and nightmares on screen. Other people like Picasso or Bernard Herrmann have more outrageous, extreme lives and experiences that sort of mirror the work.
Yeah. Really well put, Stephen. Thank you so much. You're teaching me a lot. And
no, we're just having a conversation.
Yeah, in this regard, I'm curious because one of my friends say the 3 tenets of music are theory, technique, and taste. So you got Max and Bernard. They knew their theory. They knew their technique. They could, execute it or get the right people to play it. Mm-hmm. How does one acquire taste?
Well, I hate to be the person who's always going to say I disagree with the premise, but thank goodness there isn't taste, because that suggests that we would all like the same thing. The key is, do they create something that resonates with other people to the degree that they are allowed to do it? I think is the question. And in the case of Max Steiner, who came to Hollywood in 1929 at the dawn of the talkies, the year that movies became sound only, he had studied with these great teachers in Vienna. He knew Gustav Mahler. He knew Johann Strauss Jr., the Waltz King, whose Blue Danube we know in 2001. He knew all these great Viennese legends of music. But then he became a Broadway musical director for Gershwin and Kern and Hammerstein, these giants of Broadway of the 20s. And he was working in a totally new medium when he came to Hollywood to work in sound film, because this was the first time in the history of humanity that not only could images be recorded, but exact matching sound could be created, and you could have more than one track of sound combined. So you could have dialogue, you could have sound effects and music. Originally, that was really it. You had 3 tracks you could put together for a long time. But Max was the innovator who said, I'm going to choose instruments that are in the opposite range of the person speaking at the moment, so that the instruments don't fight the voice. So he had that genius idea that he had learned from, I think, conducting live on Broadway, of making sure that the instruments he chose were complementary to and not interfering with the recorded voice. He saw, for the first time, scenes that were created, and silent could play very long, and understood how music and tension could either accelerate them, or if a film was too fast-paced, music could sometimes slow things down. And if a movie was missing a rhythm on its own, the music could create a tempo that helps us, the audience, without ever knowing it, totally subliminally paces the movie in a way that helps us enjoy it more. So that was his great innovation. Then, roughly a decade later, Bernard Herrmann, American-born from New York, comes to Hollywood. His first movie is Citizen Kane, and he and Orson Welles basically blow everything up. They say, we've never done this before. Let's try things. So they're both coming from a tradition of storytelling, of cinematic grammar, of musical grammar. But because they are so fresh and innovative in their ideas, they create Welles creates a new grammar of filmmaking, a new, not that he invented the things we see in Kane, but he brings together things that had been in the ether and creates a new language by putting them together. The deep focus photography, the framing, the hard cuts without dissolves that jump through time, all those things. And Herrmann creates a sonic landscape that is so different from what the earlier generations did. And on his next film, his second film, he incorporates electronics and ideas and multi-track recordings, so that it's just a whole new kind of thinking. I mean, what Herrmann did with sound in the 40s anticipates what the Beatles did with Sgt. Pepper and Revolver in the 60s. And Paul McCartney, when he scored a film, got a personal lesson from Bernard Herrmann. They knew each other and respected each other. So it's, I don't think there is taste per se, but I think there are people who are learned in the tradition, who are then brilliant enough to know how to smash it or try it in a new way. And we're all the beneficiaries of that.
Really well put, man. This is like a master class.
As my friend Eddie Muller says, or at least there's a sign behind him when he talks, it says bar room, not classroom, which I like.
Bar room, not classroom. That's good. But it's really, I'm really grateful for this enlightenment. And I got to ask you this, because we talked about these. Well, these are stories we hear, and I've repeated this for years in lectures about sound in movies and music in movies. Is Betty Davis yelled at some director, "I don't want Max Steiner walking, following me up these steps." Meaning, let me just explain what I hear and repeat, and then you clarify it. You'll be the best. It's because this is my take on it. What she was saying is, I want to show off my acting chops. I want people to realize I'm a great actor without Max Steiner enhancing it. So go ahead. Would you tell me what the real story is?
Well, first I'm going to say, even before you told me, as soon as you said music and film, I knew which story it was. And I devote several pages. Yes, the story told not by Davis, by the way, but by another person in the film, Geraldine Fitzgerald, was that when Betty was filming her death scene and going up the stairs, she supposedly said to director Edmund Goulding, either Max Steiner goes up those stairs or I go up those stairs, or goddamn not going up those stairs together. It's a great story. And Betty Davis certainly was capable of saying things harsh things about people she admired. I will tell you this. Betty Davis adored Max Steiner. He scored so many of her movies, and believe me, he would not have scored them if she did not approve of what he was doing. The one time she produced a film on her own at Warner Brothers, A Double Life, Stolen Life, she hired him. She was the president of the organization honoring him, and wrote, "He often made our acting better." I mean, I could go on and on. And when one interviewer asked her about that story, she simply smiled and said, "Dear old Max, I'm glad we went up those stairs together." So did she?
That's beautiful.
Yeah. So did she have a typical Betty Davis moment and say something harsh in the moment? Maybe. But did she think that he added a lot to her movies? Absolutely. Or he wouldn't have scored Jezebel, The Letter, Of Human Bondage, In This Our Life, on and on and on. So, and I have one more irresistible story about that. Years later, the son of another famous film composer saw Betty Davis at an event, and this young man said, "Oh, Ms. Davis, my father worked on your film, blah, 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 blah," and named the movie. To which Betty Davis reportedly said, "Max Steiner was my composer," and walked away.
That is such great clarification. Thank you so much. And Aaron Copland, who actually scored a film too, or maybe more than.
Right. Oh, yes, several. And he was a superb film composer.
Amazing. He talks about the 4 elements or ingredients of music as melody, harmony, rhythm, and tone color. Now, we know pretty much what melody, harmony, and rhythm is. But in layperson's terms, how do you describe what tone color means?
Well, Bernard Herrmann makes that very easy for me, because basically, I think what the great Aaron Copland, who I got to interview, what he's referring to is orchestration. And that simply means what instruments are playing which notes. And Bernard Herrmann was a brilliant dramatist, a musical dramatist. In other words, the notes and the harmonies he chose, the combinations of notes are great. But one thing that really makes him stand out and easy to recognize for people is that, unlike many composers, he approached the orchestration, the choice of instruments for each film, radically differently, because he said there's no reason a film should be scored by a traditional orchestra if that isn't the right choice for the movie. And the most extreme and famous, and I think ingenious example of that in Herrmann's career is Psycho. Psycho was made for less money than Hitchcock's other films. It was very risky for its time. They didn't make movies about cross-dressing serial killers in 1959 when it was shot. It was released in 60. And it was a really edgy movie. Paramount didn't like the subject matter. People thought it was very sordid. But Hitchcock had faith in it, put his own money in it, and did it at a price, which is to say less than his big movies. But he did hire Bernard Herrmann because he knew how important Herrmann was to his films. And Herrmann, instead of using a conventional orchestra, instead of using trumpets and brass to make us jump or percussion instruments, he wrote the score of Psycho entirely for string players. It's about 50 string players. So you've got violins, violas, cellos, basses, you know. And when asked why he chose that, he said, I wanted to create a black and white sound to match the black and white photography. And of course, anyone, I'll just say shower scene, and you think of the music, you think of that famous, well, that's one of the two most famous music cues of all time, I think, with John Williams' shark theme in Jaws. And it's an example of what Herrmann did. Just as black and white photography isn't two colors, it's thousands of colors because you have all those different shades of gray between black and white. A string orchestra isn't just one sound. It's the sound you get when you're playing a violin with a mute on it, so it sounds sad and desperate, like it does for Marion Crane, the secretary who steals the money at the beginning of Psycho. It's incredibly melancholy, not in an obvious way, but in a beautiful way, with a mute on that violin. But then you take the mute off and you slash the bridge of the violin, and you get the definitive sound of murder in the movies, you know, the Psycho cue of the shower scene. And Herrmann did that 100 times in that movie. He would find all these different colors and sounds and combinations of the stringed instruments. And so that's what Copland meant by tonal color at its most extreme, which is finding the right instruments, and then not just using the instruments, but finding new ways to create sounds with those instruments.
Really well put. You invoked two things. Billy Wilder said, black and white is more true than color. Which is really, you dove so deep into that. But just leaving that behind, I love that you called Bernard Herrmann a dramatist. That's the word drama, right? Drama. So I'm curious how you process this quote. And this is Ruth Draper. The key is to bring the audience up onto the stage and into the scene with you. It is they who must give you even more than you give them in the way of imagination and creative power. Sounds great, but how do you do that? You know, I mean, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, it's an interesting thought because I think she's saying a couple of different things. And the first I completely understand and respond to, the idea of bringing people in with you, because my favorite Bernard Herrmann quote, it's so simple, but it explains so much. I mean, he was the greatest person. He was one of the greatest composers, I'll just say, in all of music, in terms of creating character psychology in music, in writing music that when paired with an image told you what was going on in the person's head or made you wonder in a different way than anyone else. I mean, the way he conveys obsession in Vertigo or romantic longing, and the way he creates a sense of terror and anxiety in the scene of Janet Leigh sequence of her driving the car in Psycho, you know, for a long, long time with that great, slashing bridge cue. Herrmann said, and it's my favorite quote about film composers, is he said, or a composer working in film, he said, the composer's first job is to get inside the drama. In other words, it's not to say, oh, look, it's a stormy night, I'm going to play scary music, or it's an epic scene, I'm going to play epic music. It's to tell you what the person is thinking in that environment. It's to give you a psychological dimension that isn't present without the music. And that's what he did over and over. Max did that too, in his own very different way. So I think that Ruth Draper is saying, and what she and Herrmann also felt, if I can group them together, is that it was a communal experience. You know, Herrmann said that the ultimate role of film music was, he called it the ultimate cement that brings the the drama into one cohesive whole, and bringing everyone into a single experience is what he said. So it was it, and this goes back to your question about, does art exist without an audience? Well, it can. I mean, things can be written and then discovered or created and discovered centuries later. They existed and it wasn't appreciated. But yes, art really comes alive when it is when we have the feelings, the emotions of people responding to it. And that's why I think people go to live theater. It's why people, I hope, go back to the movies. I mean, I love watching movies at home, but we all know, and we've all had great experiences, I think, at the movies where we remembered how the audience reacted. And when a movie's really satisfying, the kind of spontaneous applause that happens even on an old film at the end is everybody saying that they were moved by that. And I think that and of course, what Ruth Draper was saying that isn't relevant on a film, because a film was made and exists before people see it, is she is responding to what an audience is giving her. And that's the other great thing about live performance, is that the performances are potentially always a little different, because the performers are most definitely reacting to what the audience is or is not giving to them. I mean, if it's a dead house, I know certain actors will give half a performance. And if it's a thrilling house, they can't help but be stirred into giving a performance that's perhaps more powerful.
Really well put. Thank you. And, Harry Smith learned from Bruno that the purpose of cinema is to put people to sleep, which is funny because like you said, I fall asleep during good movies. It's not because the movie is bad necessarily, as your body or you need to fall asleep. But Yoko Ono took it a step further. She says, if you dream a dream alone, it's a dream. But if you dream a dream with other people, it could be reality. So we're sitting in a movie theater. We think, everything everywhere all at once. That's real,
No, yeah. I love that you mentioned dreams, because that's something I've always been fascinated by, is the dreamlike quality of cinema. I mean, especially seeing a lot of movies when I was really young, whether it was Psycho on television or King Kong or the Twilight Zone, which Bernard Herrmann scored many of the episodes of the original series. And his music was really beautiful and eerie and disturbing. And I remember the emotion that created. And those episodes kind of went into my dreams at night as a child. But I do think that going into a movie theater, especially, and watching a film, particularly if it's a film like Vertigo, is a kind of dream. And even going back to 1924, one of my favorite Buster Keaton films is Sherlock Jr., where he's a projectionist who falls asleep and dreams that he goes into the movies. And that's pure genius. And someone I know, did she write it? No, she referred me to. There's a wonderful book on, at least one, probably many, on cinema and dreams. And it's interesting because I think we live in a time now where, whether it's a television episode or a movie, people say, oh, that wouldn't happen because legally this is how this is done and that. And that's fine. And certainly if there are gigantic gaps of logic, I won't make that jump either. But more and more, I'm on the side of I call it dream logic, which may be a well-known phrase, I guess. But dream logic to me is the logic that Hitchcock applied, which is, in The Birds, when Tippi Hedren's in the house and she goes up the stairs by herself thinking something might be there and is attacked by birds. Why does she go up there? Well, that's dream logic, because in a dream we walk towards a door and we open it, And yeah, if you approach cinema with too much of a sense of realism, and I will say that's certainly what critics and audiences did with Vertigo in 1958. That movie was either ignored or disliked by most because it has a ridiculous story, really, on the face of it. But if you look at it in a more of an allegorical, dreamlike fashion, then it becomes a much richer film. And so, I'm not saying people are wrong when they want to have the maximum amount of logic to a story. But I love the movies partly because there is an element of illogic, but we're taken along with it. I mean, think of the image of Cary Grant in a suit standing out in the middle of nowhere, and he's attacked by a crop duster plane shooting at him, when in fact someone could have driven up and shot him. Right. I mean, but the image of him running from that plane, I mean, that again entered my dreams as a child. And Hitchcock knew it would.
Totally. And it's amazing because this is the main thing with McLuhan breaking the Finnegan's Wake Code by James Joyce, which is everyone has the power to dream at night. Everybody pretty much does that and creates amazing scenarios. But artists, and not to be elitist, also dream while they're awake.
Mhm.
So that's what Hitchcock's doing. He's dreaming while he's awake and enabling us. And so I have to ask you the Stanley Kubrick question really fast, because it's similar about this effect on humans. It affected your dreams. And Stanley pulled Clockwork Orange from UK screens only for 30 years because the police sort of strong armed him and said, this is causing kids to beat up, to beat up people.
Mhm.
And so did Kubrick, and it's a stupid question, but I'm sure you can talk intelligently about it. Did Kubrick more so go along with it? Why only UK screens? Because he really believed his film was going to cause people to beat up people, or because he knew deep down inside it's a great publicity stunt because all over the world they can see it, and kids could go buy VHS bootleg copies on the streets of London. So it wasn't banned all completely, but it's sort of like this idea of rules that I'm getting into next. But just your take on that. Briefly, his
I would lean,
family's.
yeah, I would lean toward your theory number two and repeat the old adage that there is no such thing as bad publicity.
Very good. So this is the next question. You brought up the words rules early on, Stephen, and I appreciated that. The great folk singer said, Utah Phillips said, anarchy is making rules for yourself and not other people.
Hmm.
Who's entitled to make the rules?
Rules are only things that a collective body of people agree upon. So that's my answer to that. Again, it's such a complex topic when we say rules, that there really aren't rules, of course, but there are traditions, let's say. And let's just take film, for example. There's a filmic tradition that there's a logic of how you shoot a scene so you understand that two people are facing each other and talking to each other, by having one person face camera, to the right, and then you cut to someone facing to the left, and you get the feeling they're talking to each other. But there have been filmmakers who reversed that and showed the one person facing the other way talking, and then cut to the other person facing the other way, and those people are supposedly talking to each other. Well, it's not that you can't do that, but it's more confusing to an audience. So I think I'm a believer that when you break the rules, it's best to have at least an intuitively good reason, not one you have to articulate, but it either works or it doesn't for people when you break the rules. And you can't have anarchy if you don't have rules, right? You have to have some basis if you're going to shake things up.
Yeah. Really well put. I spoke with Michael Apted over 40 years ago, and I asked him, he made a documentary on the Russian rock star, and I says, why do video rock editors feel so obliged to edit fast? And now telling you this, most people don't know that Abel Gance invented rapid montage in 1922, but it really flourished in the 80s with MTV. Michael Apted said, and Marty Scorsese says, I cut my films faster because of MTV. So Michael Apted said, well, we've learned to take in information faster. I asked the question with a bias. Can we literally learn to take in information faster, or are we just brainwashed to believe we can?
Oh, we can. I mean, I think the rhythms of television, film, all the digital social media that we have now, it's incredibly fast. And I think, one thing I've heard from people when they look at an older film is, so slow. They talk so much in that movie. I've often come out of a film where people said they talk so much. There's a lot less dialogue. And in film, they didn't have the special effects that we do now. So the human beings were the special effect. You made them interesting. You made them beautiful. You made them frightening. So I think I know from my own experience and my experience in feeling like things are a little cut too fast for my taste sometimes. It just depends though.
Yeah. So a couple of my film heroes say, one of them says, ignore yourself. Jonas Mekas says there is no self-expression. And Cecil Taylor, the great jazz pianist, says, I'm just a vehicle and this stuff just comes through me. So Again, it's both and it depends, but just your overall hunch. Is art making, filmmaking, book writing more self-expression or more you're a vehicle for whatever culture, technology, or environments are prominent?
It's all of the above.
Yeah. Can art making be egoless?
Define ego.
Very good. The whole purpose of this series is to invent new questions. Yeah, I can't define ego. My follow-up question, I asked this famous movie director at USC once, I said, was Freud right? And he goes, that's beyond my pay grade. Is perception reality?
That's above my pay grade.
Tell me, Stephen, one major element of your creativeness, your output as a producer and an author that stayed the same, and one major element that's changed in the many years you've been doing this.
Wow. Well, I think the thing that stayed the same is trying to, since I began as a print writer, of trying to be evocative in the words that I choose to tell things. And the thing that I hope has improved is my visual storytelling, because one works with so many gifted cameramen and people that even as you work in documentaries, it took me a long time to really, I must confess, study the different lenses, study focal length, that determines how much blur there is behind you, to have the language of a photographer. And when I got into photography, to better communicate with my directors of photography, I just thought, oh my God, it's like, this is a language I should have, been learning all along. I knew enough, of course, to get attractive shots and to frame things well, but photography is such a rich medium in and of itself. And so I think the thing I've learned is how to use visuals more powerfully and understand how to create the visuals myself. I do my own shooting sometimes. Certainly during the pandemic, as I continued working, I would shoot things myself, or if a project pre-pandemic, the budget was so low, I would shoot the interviews myself. If I was really in trouble, I taught myself to sound record, video record, do the makeup, and try to do the interview at the same time. And most people will who do that will say you can't do them all well at the same time. You can't be totally engaged with someone speaking as we're doing now while you're saying, is their forehead dry? Are they, is it turned too much? Did that light go out behind them? That's what's so wonderful about having a great director of photography, a cameraman, call him what you will, camera person, is that they can look at the visual while you're listening to the person, and at the same time, if you're doing the sound, it's like, oh my gosh, is the sound level good? Did the battery die on that on that overhead mic? But you can try to do all those things, but it's a challenge.
It's
But
really
I guess, yeah, that's what I've tried to learn those crafts to complement the writing and see how they all fit together, I guess, is my answer.
Right. And it's interesting because having studied experimental film for 50 years, as well as mainstream Hollywood film and art cinema, Europe, cinema all over the world, 130 years isn't that long for a medium. It's a pretty amazing medium. And that, the experimental filmmakers are that often. They're like one person project. And they do have to think all that. So it's interesting to compare and contrast. But you brought up something that we study a lot called sense ratio shifting. And, it's basically, we agree there's sort of like 5 senses. And neuroscientists say sight is the most dominant sense.
Mm-hmm.
How do you suss that out? Because then, here's the thing. When we were no books, we were more ear-oriented. So we would say the ear was more dominant because we're listening. And then we create books and people become eye-oriented for communication reasons. So then in the long run, people still say, well, this neuroscientist in particular said, well, Sight is the most dominant sense. What's your take on that? You work in all the senses with your work. How would you say?
Well, I think we are. This is that ridiculous but inescapable thing people seem to have thought. Everyone's thought about at some point. If they had to lose a sight, what would they want to keep? Most people lose a sense. What would they keep? And almost everyone seems to say sight over sound. And I love silent films. I love the art of storytelling that really was at its zenith when it ended in the late 1920s. It was I loved filmmakers like Buster Keaton, who was a brilliant director who used very few intertitles in his movies and could tell stories without them. The German director Murnau made a film called The Last Laugh that almost has no text in it at all, and it was an international hit. It's also the movie that changed movies the most in terms of he would have a mobile camera. He'd have his cameraman walking with it like a steady cam, back when these were big bulky things. So Murnau, Keaton, others you can name, Hitchcock, really wanted to try to tell stories as visually as possible. So, but then on the other hand, there's great radio drama. We had great radio drama in the 30s and 40s. Orson Welles, Bernard Herrmann, those were the masters of that field of radio drama. Went away in America for decades, has sort of come back now in the form of podcasts and things. In Britain, they never stopped doing it. So, stories can be told in different media. I think we use all the media, use the senses we have. So
that was
no
good.
answer.
We only
no
that
answer.
was really, I appreciate your time and energy here. I've learned a lot, and we only got about 5 more minutes, so I really appreciate it. Just a couple more questions. Moshe Feldenkrais works with healing and movement. He says it's literally possible to identify a weakness and incorporate it to become a strength, rather than we're normally taught to overcome a weakness. Tell me a weakness you turned into a strength.
Well, I think it's fascinating. Do you mean me personally or others?
Well, you put into the context you want. I would love you personally, or you can put in any context you want.
Very briefly, I'll say one weakness I have that can be a strength is that I'm stubborn. I don't like it when I can't figure something out. If a technology isn't working, or if I can't get to the bottom of a story, I will dig and dig. I am persistent that way. Yeah. And one thing that in writing about, I'll go back to my books on Bernard Herrmann and Max Steiner, and the 50 or so episodes of A&E biography that I produced, is I've come to believe with creative people that their greatest strength was inextricably linked to their greatest weakness. And that if you could give them pills, to take away the problematic side of themselves, it would have just taken away that little ingredient or big ingredient in them that made them who they are artistically. And just briefly, I'll give examples of that. Max Steiner from Vienna grew up in this beautiful age of luxury and waltzes and beautiful women and chorus girls in his father's theater and the romance of the turn of the century, of the 19th century. And he was a passionate man, and he really loved people. And his music reflects that. I mean, you listen to scores like Casablanca or now Voyager or so many others that he wrote, and they work even though they're intensely emotional because they come from his heart sincerely. He's not manufacturing that emotion. He had such romantic passion in him. He had such love for his son that when he writes for young people, there's beauty in that and there's poignancy in it. So at the same time, Max was a workaholic who drove away his own son and was married 4 times and had a very fragmented personal life because he was so enraptured with writing music. So the passion he had for life and for creativity made him a bad father and an inattentive husband. Although he was a good guy, I have to say he was a really, really good person at heart. Bernard Herrmann remains famous as one of the most temperamental people to ever work in Hollywood. And that's saying a lot. He was famous for his scorching tirades against people. He could be calm one moment and just screaming the next. He was a really explosive person. But that's why we have the music of Psycho. And that's why he understood Travis Bickle in Taxi Driver, a score that he finished the night he died. He finished the recording session and died that night. The movie's dedicated to him. And just think about it. His first movie, he's doing a musical portrait of Charles Foster Kane and Citizen Kane. Then he's doing the psychological portraits of Vertigo, of Psycho, of Marnie. And then Scorsese, brings him in to tell us what's going on in the head of Travis Bickle. And all of that tumult in Herman. And I should say Herman was also romantic, generous, calm, funny, fantastic lecturer, and the best writer of any composer I know of in the 20th century. He was such an articulate writer, of words. And at the same, so how could he be that person who was so delightful, who could also just be out of control? And it was simply that he could not control his temper, his emotion. And I have to say, it was often triggered by things that he thought were wrong, and by people he thought were doing things for pure commercial profit over doing the best choice for something. Not always, though. Sometimes he was just irrationally angry. But if you gave him the meds that fixed that part of him, I don't think he could have written Psycho. I don't think he could have written Taxi Driver.
Thank God. And that's interesting because we call that turn a breakdown into a breakthrough.
Yes.
And those were so well illustrated. Now, we've gone 90. Just so I know how many minutes, can you go another 5 or 10, or you got to go now?
You proved that we do 90. And for the record, I'd have to say, I don't think I have 90 minutes of things to talk about. How about another 5? Let's split the difference.
Okay, another 5 is perfect, because I had to tell you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have to tell you, Kurosawa said, how do you want to die? He says, on the set. And I go, cut, boom.
Well, Bernard Herrmann came the closest to doing that.
That was amazing when you said, how do you find peace of mind, Stephen?
Oh, I love animals. My wife and I both have cats. We've loved dogs. There's something about being loved so completely by something that no matter what a shit I have been during the day, if I ever have been in my life, no, if I've ever been impatient or less than my best self, I'll look at my animal. And again, boy, this is like quoting a pincushion saying, but try to be the person that your animal pet thinks you are. That's about as profound as I get. Try to be a good person. Try to be the person my cat thinks I am.
That's beautiful.
And that's what brings me peace. No, listening to great music, being inspired by great, art, and sharing it with someone, and enjoying it with someone else is sublime.
That's it. If you were walking down the street today and you met yourself as a 12-year-old, what would you say to your 12-year-old self?
I won't tell you. That's not what I tell my 12-year-old self. But no, it's really hard because, we all go through life and, I'm sure everybody has had a moment of, if I only knew then what I knew now. But do you know the Twilight Zone episode Walking Distance with Gig Young? It was scored by Bernard Herrmann. It's just a heartbreaker. It's about a man who goes back to his hometown by accident, and he steps back into the 1930s. It's 1959. So he sees himself as a child. He sees his parents, and he tries to tell his young self all the things about life that the child didn't know to appreciate before they're gone. And it doesn't end well. It doesn't end terribly, but it doesn't end well. And I think that what Rod Serling, who wrote that episode, captured so poignantly was not only the fact that we often wish we could go tell ourselves these things, but the inescapable truth that person wouldn't listen. They would be who they were. They wouldn't say, oh, I'm going to change how I'm going to be from now on because the stranger who says he's me is telling me how to live, So that's why I think it would be a fool's errand, even if we could go back and tell ourselves things.
It's very interesting because how you answered that was, I won't tell you. And just to clarify, you meaning, Jerry, I'm not going to tell you what I would tell my 12-year-old. Or were you saying, I won't tell you, saying to yourself? Which one were you?
I won't tell you, Jerry, because
right.
Basically I'd say, that time but this happened, do this instead. And you remember,
right. No, I just wanted to, I wanted to clarify because that's amazing because 95% of people say, "Oh, it'll be okay." You know, and you know, I can tell you all the great answers I've had over 40 years, but the same thing that Dr. John, the great pianist, said to me was, "I won't go there." Like he answered all these questions, but it was like a little too voodoo. Like, you're gonna time travel me there, or however I want to. I love it that he says I won't go there. You know, so
And also, I think that both he and I, you create a little sense of mystery by saying that, because the truth is, all it really would be a list of kind of tedious things that the things we all screw up on the
oh,
road to adulthood.
that's totally, you know, the great experimental filmmaker Martha Colburn. She goes, "What do you mean? Do I have any regrets?" I says, "No." "What would you tell your 12-year-old?" She goes, "Quit drinking all that peppermint schnapps," which I thought was brilliant because she grew up like white trash, and it was like, you know, you could see her. So, just a couple more. Can you forget to die?
I think we went one question too far, Jerry.
Okay. Okay.
But
Here's
you know what? Thank you. I will forget to die. Thank you very much for that tip. I will now forget to die. Thank you.
good, but no, here's the last one actually. Stephen, this has been truly enlightening. Thank you.
It's been very fun. Thank you.
Yeah, what gives you the most optimism?
The most optimism. Uh, the most optimism. Gosh, you know, all I can say is pessimism doesn't work.
Yeah.
Uh, you know, the thing that gives me optimism is knowing that when you go in the other direction, it doesn't get any better. So you might as well go forward. You know, we all have times in our lives where we feel really down,
Yeah.
and there's no easy solution for that. There's grief of losing people. There's, God, I screwed that up, whatever it is, or there's reading the news any day today, you know. So optimism is just because to be is better than to not be. That's all I
Yeah.
can say.
It's really beautiful. Stephen, thank you so much. It's been so fun and enlightening. I'd love for
Great.
not never hit the stop button because I'd love to talk to you about a million other things, but maybe some way down the line we can talk more.
That would be fun. I really have to say, you gave me. I've never been asked 99.9% of those questions. No, yeah, everything except for how I got into the business. I've never been asked before, so that made it so much fun. Thank you, and you do a great job. You're a great interviewer.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. I'm gonna hit the end button, but I hope it never ends.
Cut. Thank you, Jerry. Take care.